Welcome to virtual Colorado MahlerFest. I'm Ken Woods. Thank you for joining us. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you in the upcoming video Peter Davison, a regular speaker at Colorado MahlerFest and one of the most knowledgeable and engaging Mahler scholars in the world today. Peter was for over 20 years the artistic consultant of the Bridgewater Hall, where he helped establish that venue's famed International Concert Series. And in 2010-2011, he was one of the guiding lights of the Mahler in Manchester Festival, a project which presented a series of all of the Mahler symphonies working in partnership with the BBC Philharmonic, the Halle, and Manchester Camerata. Peter and I spoke last week about Mahler's Eighth Symphony, inspired in part by the recent publication of Stephen Johnson's inspiring new book on the subject. There were some audio and video issues in the course of our Zoom call, for which we apologize, but we live in challenging times. We hope you enjoy the talk. Please stay tuned to Colorado MahlerFest via our website, Facebook, and Twitter feeds throughout this week of music and exploration. Thank you for joining us. Peter, it's great to talk to you.
Thanks, Ken. It's lovely to be taking part in the MahlerFest, albeit at a great distance.
Yes, it's a festival like none we've ever experienced before. We're going to talk today about Mahler's Eighth Symphony. It's very much on the mind of Mahlerians worldwide right now, I think, because of the very acclaimed new book by Stephen Johnson, which has got everyone talking. But it is also, at this particular historical moment, really the last piece on earth that any of us are going to get to play anytime soon. It is the least socially distanced piece of music I think probably ever written. So to think about this piece is hopefully comforting rather than distressing, but it is the ultimate public work of art, I think.
Yes, it's a major public celebration of togetherness, which is of course the one thing we can't do at the moment. So yes, we can dream on about Mahler's Eighth. I think it will happen again someday in some particular venue with cast of thousands.
It's, you know, the best lines become useful and relevant in different contexts, and Mahler's line about "my time will come" seems to apply in a new way in the age of COVID-19. Hopefully there will be a time where we can get these big groups back on stage again. Of course, the premiere of Mahler's Eighth Symphony was one of the biggest triumphs, if not the biggest triumph of his life as a musician, wasn't it?
Yes, this was in September 2010 in Munich, and anyone who was anyone in the sort of German-speaking world appeared to be there, including Thomas Mann, Erich Korngold, Stefan Zweig, and countless others. I think Schoenberg wasn't able to be, but I'm sure he would have liked to have been. So yes, it was a gathering of the Germanic clans in a way, and Mahler didn't fail to deliver. He really produced something seemed to have left an indelible memory for anyone who was there, and people were still talking about it and raving about it. Even his appeared to be temporarily over in some ways by it. And this was quite exceptional in Mahler's history of performing his own music. I mean, generally, and the critics were very divided about it, and the majority were probably rather skeptical about him as a composer, in a way they're not skeptical about him as a musician. They saw him as, you know, just tinkering, incompetent a lot of the time, and that his music was rather eccentric, and that it was very indulgent for him to perform his own with these incredible ensembles that he worked with. But on this occasion, it all came together. Everything seemed to work. The public, the critic, the promoters, everybody seemed to be very happy with it.
It's interesting because it was, you know, this breakthrough occasion for him during his lifetime, and it's always been a piece that's popular with the general public, I think. But amongst Mahler fans, I think it divides opinion, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, because I suppose in many ways it doesn't fit with the general pattern of his work. It appears to be some throwback to an earlier phase in his compositional career, more in tune with the horn symphonies, the early works of the 1880s, 1890s, rather than apparently looking forward to the more works that were to follow. And I think for a lot of musicologists and fans, they feel somehow he may have sold out in some way to gain easy popularity. The work is almost really joyful throughout its sort of 60 plus minutes of music, which in Mahler's terms is completely unheard of. I mean, this is by reputation one of the most tortured and complex, psychologically complex composers who ever lived. So to be writing this very uninhibitedly, forwardly beautiful music seems around suspicion, perhaps in some ways. But I think it should be taken at face value, and I think Mahler rated it very highly in his oeuvre. I think he considered it perhaps his greatest to the culture around him. Whether that any less profound than, say, the Ninth Symphony or the 10th Symphony or the Das Lied von der Erde, I think we can have that discussion, of course, as we go on. But I think in terms of technical musical competence, in terms of compositional conviction, in terms of the realization of his idea, I think it's as successful as any of his works, and in some ways more compact and more coherent, perhaps, than some of his other works.
I mean, it's interesting in a way. I think the strengths of the two parts of this work are very different. And I would say, the first movement of the Eighth Symphony, it is one of the most focused and structurally perfect things he ever wrote, isn't it? I mean, there's not a dull moment in it. Everything works. It's actually quite classically organized. It's a tour de force of counterpoint and motivic development from beginning to end, all in service of the sort of joyful mood. And then the second part is not only in a different language, but it's much more sort of free-flowing, almost improvisational or operatic structure to it, moving away from the sort of symphonic archetype that you have in the first half of the piece.
That's true. I suppose that the texts are important, making structural contrasts in as much as we have a Latin text that's in fairly strict strophic forms with a fairly rigid kind of metrical structure. Yeah, the second part obviously is a setting of Goethe's, the final scene of Goethe's Faust Part 2, and that's in language. It's much freer, much more romantic in style, and therefore that invites a freer musical setting. There's a great flow of mythological characters, and very much in the world, personal feeling, something emanating from Goethe's ordinary imagination. Whereas I think in part one, we're dealing with a hymn, essentially. You might sing in church, and it's an old Catholic hymn from the early medieval period. So I think there's almost a deliberate choosing of maximum contrast here by Mahler, a movement that is full of anachronisms, archaic in style, perhaps looking back to Bach, and in Latin, and much more rigidly structured, and then something which is much more personal, much more individual, much more romantic in tone. And Mahler's really trying to show these are two sides of a coin in a way, and this is defined by the thematic and some textual links that are made between the movements. So I think the old complaint that these two parts are too far apart to make the symphony coherent isn't borne out by the experience of the performance, where we hear an extraordinary level of unity and the exploration of philosophical ideas through the developed motives. I mean, it's quite Wagnerian in that sense. The leitmotif idea is there. That the music develops as the ideas develop, and the unity of the thing is expressed in the way that at the beginning and the end of the work we do the same music essentially in slightly altered form.
It's interesting with sort of large-scale choral works of conspicuously great composers from late in their lives that it seems often that these pieces sort of draw out of them a sort of Janus faced approach to music in which they're looking back to the great models of the past and sort of anticipating the revolutions of the future. I mean, the Mozart Requiem, one thing it doesn't sound much like is classical era Mozart. There's a lot of Handel and there's a lot of sort of proto-Verdi or Wagner in it. Likewise, the Missa Solemnis of Beethoven. And it strikes me that this might be one of the reasons that people who love Mahler find Mahler 8 a little bit off-putting, because the big influences are Bach and Handel, expressed with a romantic orchestra and romantic forces. But there is also an element of musical modernity, and we'll see that in some of the excerpts we listen to.
Yes.
That, you know, he's actually stretching the language a lot farther than he does in a work like the Second Symphony, for instance.
That's true. But I think if you think of Berg at that time was arranging Bach for massive orchestra, the St. Anne Prelude and Fugue, for instance. We had Stokowski sometime later doing the Toccata in D minor. So there was this fact for bigging up Bach, if you like, because we have to remember that Bach had 100 years of neglect and was really only fully revived during the 19th century. So the discovery of this, highly complex, contrapuntally skilled composer was something that was very influential upon the generation of musicians that followed Mendelssohn. I mean, obviously, we've got the Meistersinger of Wagner, which owes tremendous amount to Bach, and composers like Reger, who were alive at the same time as Mahler, also by the potential of highly chromatic and complex contrapuntal works and so on. So I think Mahler's interesting counterpoint, which is present in all his works, of course, that's quite a lot to late Beethoven and the use of fugue in late Beethoven.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean, I think we could, some of the models for the Mahler 8 might include the Beethoven Missa Solemnis, the Beethoven Ninth Symphony, both works that use fugal elements, contrapuntal elements to a very large degree. And looking back further, yes, I agree with you that there's Bach there, the Matthew Passion, the B minor Mass might have been in Mahler's mind, and the big Handel oratorios, which we know that the big tune in the finale of the First Symphony probably came out of the Hallelujah chorus, we have to say. So yes, I mean, Mahler knew all these things, and I think the deliberate evocation of what one might call dying traditions in some ways might have been in Mahler's mind. He was postmodern before modern had happened. So he was very aware that these traditions of oratorio, the song, the Lieder tradition, the grand opera tradition, all these traditions were a lot of scrutiny and maybe weren't going to survive into the 20th century. And it's almost as if he's trying to rescue these things from the past and making them live again for his own time. And then in part two, I think you get something which in Mahler's mind was more contemporary, closer to Wagner perhaps and Strauss, in terms of something psychologically real to experience in the way that Mahler's more adventurous music is.
Well, should we listen to a little bit of the opening of the piece just to give listeners who are new to the work a sense of how it gets going? And we've both mentioned counterpoint. I mean, there's an explosion of counterpoint right from the beginning of the movement. And one of the things that Mahler shows in this is that he can start with a lot going on and continue to build the texture through the movement. So it'll be interesting to compare this with the even more intense use of counterpoint in the middle section of the movement. But we're going to put technology to work now and share a little bit of the opening of Mahler's Eighth Symphony. A couple of things occurred to me listening to that. First of all, he starts out a little bit like the Eroica, just a big E flat major chord. It doesn't get much simpler than that. And your first inclination when the choir starts singing is that it's initially all quite homophonic, and how quickly over the next 90 seconds he develops the texture quickly into something much, much more complicated. And then suddenly we're into this episode with the soloist in a different tempo, different atmosphere, different thematic material. I mean, people tend to think of Mahler, because the durations of the music are often quite long, as being slow moving, but it's not in a Brucknerian sense at all slow moving. It's much more like Wagner, where it's something new every few bars, and the density of activity is really something. The other thing that strikes me listening to it, is just the incredible expectations he has of the performers. Not only the number of performers required, but to find a team of soloists who all have big enough voices to do what's required of them in this piece, but can also sing seamlessly as an ensemble. The ensemble writing is some of the most difficult, I think, in any vocal work that I can think of off the top of my head, isn't it?
I mean, it's so multi-layered in terms of the texture, with, as you say, with the 8 soloists, double chorus, and then this fantastic large orchestra, which is weaving in and out and underlining counterpoints and layers in all sorts of subtle ways, plus the developmental aspect, the sort of horizontal aspect, with the music, the texture of the music changing quite fast, as you say, from a sort of homophonic shout at the start to these very complex lines. Keys are changing all the time. The harmony is much more chromatic than perhaps the ear at first assumes. It's much more complex in terms of the way chords move around than one would imagine. I mean, the fluency that you hear is in a way almost a miracle, because there's so much that could go wrong, and the density and the complexity of the music should make it very hard to listen to. Although Mahler has he has such a brilliant that the effect is utterly seamless, and it sounds rather to the listener, but it belies its extraordinary complexity in many ways. And I think that's true as the movement goes on. It seems to be the art that goes art. The orchestral technique is so marvelous that it sounds as if it's just flowed right out of his heart, really, and yet technically it's a remarkable accomplishment, I think, to have created this edifice, this musical edifice.
One of the things that's not necessarily obvious to a non-musician in the opening of the piece is that right from the first bars, Mahler is changing the meters very frequently, from 4/4 to 3/4 to 2/4 to 6/4. He was much underestimated, I think, as an innovator in the area of rhythm, going back even as early as the first 2 symphonies, where he starts to mix things like offstage bands playing in different tempos, mixing meters in the Second Symphony finale. By the time of the 6th Symphony, the scherzo of that, he's pushing things farther than anyone had, and by the time you get to the 10th Symphony, he's pushed it farther than even Stravinsky would in the Rite of Spring.
Yes.
There's a fascinating passage coming up, which we'll hear now, which is one of the few extended bits of instrumental music, and really this is about as rhythmically complicated as I think anyone had written up to this point in musical history, isn't it? say that composition is the art of transition, and that's an amazing transition there, isn't it?
Yes, I was thinking that maybe Mahler's constantly shifting rhythms is part of this idea that the sort of divine energies are sort of spilling out, spilling all over. They're not sort of fitting in a neat mold, but they have exuberance that's constantly pushing over the bar lines, constantly disrupting rhythmic expectations. It's part of that great sense of energy that comes over. If it was very four square, I think that would not be so apparent. There's all feeling energy is so strong it can't be contained. It's sort of bursting out of its normal containers, and I think that the section that we're probably going to come to next, this Accende Lumen Sensibus, seems to take that up another level. It's just a sort of explosion of hot energy, and I think also very much, which comes in the second part, this idea that life is experienced through the senses. It's the contact with the divine is not some cerebral sort of attraction. It's something felt in your fingertips, in your loins, in your sort of bursting energies and so on. So it's very much a visceral experience. This whole work is very visceral, almost never cerebral, I would say. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, the counterpoint, even the counterpoint in the first movement, which you might say could sound rather academic, it sounds anything but academic. It's just like excuse me, many voices all out at once. That's the idea. It's something very physical.
One of the things I think contributes to that sense of ecstasy is the thematic material that he uses, which is permeated mostly with leaps. There's very little stepwise motion of these big leaps of fourths and sevenths all the way through the piece, which gives it a sort of explosive character.
Yes, it's leaping over hurdles rather than crawling along the ground, isn't it? It's a certain boundlessness about it. But also, I think it's been observed. I think Johnson observes it in his book that there are lots of links with the Sixth and the Seventh Symphony, particularly in this main theme. It's not dissimilar from the main themes of both of the first movements of both of those works. But here it's taken on this kind of it's lost its sense of stress which it's had in those other works. It's become ironed out into something much more joyful and relaxed in some ways. But those links are there. I think that this idea that the Eighth Symphony appears out of nowhere, doesn't fit into the general context of Mahler's symphonic development, that's not true. I think that it grew naturally, I think, out of the final movement in the symphony, the rondo finale, which is very communal, very celebratory, is full of fourths and sevenths superimposed at times, and also very contrapuntal movement. So I think in some ways you could almost say there's a very natural development out of the seventh into the first movement of the eighth.
One thing that's appears for the first time in the seventh, and which he extends in the eighth, is a sort of more 20th century way of using the interval of the fourth. In the early, I mean, it is his favorite interval throughout his whole musical life. Even through the Sixth Symphony, the fourth is most often used to sort of reinforce the sense of where the tonic is. You know, you start on the fifth of the key and go to the tonic via the interval of a fourth, and he does it both stepwise and in leaps. But by the time you get to the seventh, he's starting to introduce melodies which are in fourths, and it strikes in the Eighth Symphony that the fourth is a gesture away from the tonic almost always, and almost never a gesture to the tonic. It's always, as in the very beginning of the piece, starting from one and going away and taking us on a journey in a way.
Yes, it's interesting to know that Schoenberg was writing his first chamber symphony, which opens with that string of fourths and is full of quartal harmonies. He was probably writing that about the same time that he was visiting Mahler, when Mahler was writing the Seventh Symphony, and one can speculate that he might have found a bit of the Seventh Symphony on Mahler's piano, and maybe Mahler played it, and then he went back, incorporated it into his chamber symphony, or it could have been the other way around. Of course, they could have had heated discussions about the possibilities of using quartal harmonies, and Mahler, got the idea from Schoenberg. We'll probably never know, but certainly this double fourth, which becomes the seventh in the Eighth Symphony, this is really the sort of basic melodic imprint of the whole work. It's there at the beginning and it's there at the end.
Mm. Should we listen to a little bit of the middle section of the movement? And I mean, this must be, if not the most exciting passage ever composed, certainly right up there. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to think of any bit of music that's got more sheer energy to it. And I mean, it starts at 100 miles an hour and just accelerates from there, doesn't it? well. It's
Yeah. Yeah. We all need to take our breath again.
amazing. I mean, it's just, there's so many moments in that segment where you think this is it. This is the most exciting thing I've ever heard, and then he surpasses it.
Takes it up a notch, and he signals that recapitulation so far off with the 6/4 chord, doesn't he? And
Yeah.
but you just think it's never going to come. It's never going to come, and then finally it arrives. But and then of course he's got to outdo what he did in the opening. It's got to sound bigger and louder and more spectacular, which he manages to do with a bit of percussion and a few extra fanfares thrown in. But I mean, he set the bar so high to get that recapitulation to really hit home. He's got to sort of pull off something quite remarkable.
Well, and I think it's amazing too how he keeps the excitement going through that moment. That that return to the opening material and the top key can feel like a release point, to the point that the music loses a little bit of excitement, because he keeps that B flat pedal going there. First of all, it changes the harmonic balance of this music that we've heard before, but it also gives the sense that it could still be building further into the recap, which is just amazing. Well, should we?
And there's a sense of relief as well, because we've been through quite a tortuous development there with the Hostem Repellas, which is really throughout the enemy, it's a war cry, and it's got pretty tortured and fragmented. So that when all this comes together with the recapitulation moment, there is a sense of great release. We finally expelled the devil or the enemy or whoever or whatever is to be holding this music back. It is a fantastic moment. I think we've described it before as an air-punching moment of arrival. It's a goal scored. It's one in the back of the net.
It is. I mean, and one last thought before we go into the second part of the piece is just his ability to judge what the human voice is capable of is amazing. I mean, the fact that you can hear the solo voices, and that's not being artificially manipulated on this recording particularly, because I've heard the piece live many times, and when you hear the first soprano soaring over everyone in the chorus and everyone in this huge orchestra, it's just amazing that he can judge that and make it work as he does. And of course, the soprano on this is the Canadian soprano Erin Walsh. It's just such an incredible voice that she has.
Yes, he understands that it's not just about volume. It's sometimes about pitch. It's sometimes about color. It's I mean, there's nothing. It's all with Mahler. The orchestral textures and the way he uses voices is very in real experience, isn't it? It's never something just invented in his head. He spent many hours in the pit of the orchestra pit of a theatre, listening to how a Wagnerian size orchestra works with singers. He's known that from the inside out. It's very much a product of somebody who just knows his musical chops in a big way.
He was, of course, also both a great operatic conductor and a great song composer, and I think those skill sets come even more to the fore in the second half of the piece, this sort of chain of little set pieces for different singers. And I thought it'd be interesting to start with the first two of those. Mahler loves to juxtapose opposites, I think, and so these part two begins with the only really extended bit of instrumental music in the symphony. It's about 10 minutes of instrumental prelude as he sets the scene of this sort of natural wonderland in which Faust finds himself after his death. And then once the voices come in, we have the two men, first the baritone and then the bass. And the character of the music of these two is so different, isn't it?
Yes, it's the Pater Ecstaticus comes first, I think, isn't it? And he is much more in the sort of the sort of burning intensity of love, isn't it? It's music that's, again, it picks up somewhat on the exuberance of the first part, but it has much more romanticism. This could be something a Wagnerian opera aria, could be something also by Schubert, maybe, I don't know, but it's got that romantic intensity, and it's a sort of I think Stephen Johnson describes it has a sort of masochistic quality. The power of love is so strong, it's sort of burning me up.
Yeah.
So it's very fiery music in that sense. The Parte Profundus section reminds me a lot of the first movement of the Third Symphony. Some of the nature painting in there. This is volcanic lava, rocks and deep gorges and terrifying drops, sheer crags and so on. It's music of real raw elemental power, and it's much less stable, I think. But again, it ends with this plea for redemption, for the burning power of love to transform Faust's soul. I think this is really the idea almost of a kind of purgatory, and that might make us think a little bit of the dream of Gerontius, which I think there are some parallels with. This love is so strong, it's going to burn away all the bad stuff, and once Faust has burnt off his bad stuff, he's going to be released into the heavens and to receive the reward of his redemption. Although it always slightly puzzles me that he doesn't appear to have done anything to deserve this. I mean, Gretchen, who was in part one of Faust, whom he wronged terribly badly, appears to come back to redeem him, and absolutely doesn't deserve this. And I'm sure that, but there she is, and along with the three male figures, Marianos perhaps acting as the bridge to the three penitent women who are really the intermediaries to take him up to the highest level, the highest spheres, where he meets the Queen of Heaven. But I guess we've got an example to hear soon, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it occurs to me just as you're saying that given his own complex personality, I mean, it does seem that there's a sense in his music that he likes the idea of salvation without causation. Both the end of the Second Symphony and this piece, in a way, sort of saying, well, even if you've been a bit of a rebel, or even if you're not a believer, he says at the end of the Second Symphony, everyone is saved, not just the believers.
That's true.
The do-gooders. And here, Faust, who seems unredeemable, proves to be redeemed. And
yes, but that's also part of his idealization of woman as a symbol, isn't it? And the Alma, his wife, who carried the projection of his sort of idealization. I mean, she was never going to live this extraordinary expectation that he had of her as a kind of goddess in his life. Clearly, there is this sense, and it's kind of Freudian resonance here, that the woman is the giver, the mother figure who will love her son regardless of what he's done or whoever he is. It's a kind of almost a birthright that mothers will love their sons, and Mahler sees this as a kind of redeeming force, as Goethe did as the eternal feminine. Also inherent in nature itself, that however we bespoil the world around us, whatever mess we make of our lives, whatever evil we might do, the Great Mother still loves us, and we are still part of this extraordinary unified universe. A sort of it's almost a kind of if do go wrong, it's only temporary, and it's just the falling out among friends. It's never, we can never be fully at odds with the world around us.
Well, let's hear these first two vocal bits from part two. Wow, what amazing stuff. I mean, I've known this piece for a long time, worked on it, covered it, rehearsed it. That is some of the strangest music that Mahler ever wrote, isn't it? I mean, it's just the grotesquerie of some of those woodwind colors, and then this violin writing that's just on the edge of what's humanly possible. I mean, and for many orchestras over the edge of what's possible.
Yes, and it seems to look forward to some of the more complex and tortured music of the 10th Symphony, doesn't it? It's got that sort of level of chromaticism in it, which of course contrasts very greatly with the music with which that movement is opened, which is almost statically diatonic and slow moving in its harmonic rhythm. So again, with Mahler, it's always these great contrasts. His musical language seems to be infinitely adaptable to whatever context it's put. I mean, and that makes him a brilliant songwriter for that reason, because the music can almost go in any direction according to what the text demands. There aren't these constraints. I mean, he's not Arvo Pärt. I mean, I suppose you could say. It's much more a sort of plastic Wagnerian kind of language, which can adapt to any sort of text. It can be extremely chromatic, extremely fast, or extremely slow and extremely diatonic. It can be agony, full of agony, or it can be serene and almost sometimes, within 2 bars. It's a kind of it's music that's very psychologically flexible.
I mean, the Wagner influence, I think, in terms of his sense of dramatic pacing, is particularly to the fore in this work, maybe more than anywhere else in Mahler. And one of the things that you see in Wagner is that he varies the pace at which the drama unfolds very consciously. And, so if he's had a scene where there's a certain amount of stasis, the next bit will be very fast moving, and vice versa. And here, you've just had a sort of 10-minute orchestral interlude of mostly very slow music. And that first baritone aria is only 80 seconds long. It's a little bit like those very pithy songs in the Rückert-Lieder, where it's over and done in less than 2 minutes. Very neatly etched miniature. And he has an amazing ability in this piece to create these moments that are actually very memorable, and they stick with you in the course of the piece, that are actually only a minute and a half long. And I thought it'd be interesting to look at one, probably the most famous, the Mater Gloriosa bit, which is the ultimate little sort of dramatic masterstroke, in the sense that it comes from nowhere, it only lasts a few seconds. But it sets up the perfect mood for which this then very grand and slow-moving finale of the work can unfold from.
Yes.
shall we hear it first, and then maybe talk a
Yes, let's
little
do
bit
that.
about? Yeah. Let's. But talk a little bit about what she's saying and what that moment means in the piece.
Well, I think it is. It's the moment that, if you like, comes to the way to heaven, isn't it? And it made me think a little bit of the finale of the Fourth Symphony, which is a very much an angelic persona. The soprano adopts an angelic persona, and there we've entered heaven in that instance as well. Obviously, the Goethe text again is very much setting the scene here. I mean, Mahler's obviously got to follow the order of that, but there is a sense in which we are moving up step at a time, and then finally we come to the gateway where the revelation is going to be made. And from that point on, Faust is released, and you almost sense in the music that he's able to fly. That suddenly the music seems to take on this kind of floating quality, but it also has a wonderful sense of purpose. It knows exactly where it's going. It knows its end, if you like. And that increasing intensity and fluency and the sense of we're really taking off now, we're leaving earthly constraints behind. That becomes, that's what this moment unlocks, I think. And it very much literally is our attention, highest spheres imaginable, because obviously the very high pitch of the voice. And in that particular clip we saw there, she adopted clearly an angelic persona. I mean, this is, we're moving towards the chorus mysticus, which is the climax of the book, and the very famous text, the Alles Vergängliche text of Goethe, which summarizes really the two parts of Faust that he wrote, which is a massive and largely impractical dramatic project, but which seems to encompass almost all human experience. And this is very much the climax of that. And of course, all German speakers revere it as almost like a national myth, in the same way that English-speaking people might revere Shakespeare, Hamlet or something like this. So for them, Faust, this final scene, is very much a celebration of the great potential of their culture, and the very best of their culture. I mean, when one sees historically what was going to happen, and what was brewing in the German-speaking culture at the time, of course, this seems hopelessly idealistic. And I think there is very much in this Mahler piece and the way it ends, a sense of defiance against the prevailing sort of pessimism of the times, the sense that everything was crumbling and coming to some kind of decadent close. I think Mahler was almost versely holding up a vision and saying, the best things of our culture really open all potential, and we shouldn't be quite so gloomy and pessimistic about the future. I mean, sadly, history probably wasn't on his side in that, but I think we can hold on to it nonetheless as something which offers hope and a lot of joy, which in Mahler's music is quite a rare commodity. So I think yes. So this moment is really unlocking all of that. It's taking us into beyond any earthly imagining. Really, I think that's the way it goes.
Well, that's very cruel of me, isn't it? But I thought we'd try and encourage people to go listen to the whole thing. But maybe I'll tag on the very end of the piece. But that is just incredible music, isn't it? And
Mm, mm,
amazing after a piece that's mostly so action packed and event driven, that you have this sort of very, very almost imperceptible build up for about 4.5 minutes there, from as slow and as soft as possible to that
mm,
arrival that
mm.
we were just getting to there, and drawn out really as far as the music can be, I think.
Yes, yes, and what we didn't hear there at the end is that the seventh returns from the opening bars, but now as a major ninth. So it's got stretched even further, sort of striving for this sort of leap into the ether has got even larger, uh, and and yet at the same time it is extraordinarily intimate. You know, these but chorus. Um, Beautiful cadence that leads into the chorus mysticus with the piano and the mandolin and the harp. These are extraordinarily delicate colors and lovely clarinets or sub-clarinet. We're not so far away from the Song of the Earth, which is the next work that he wrote, which seems a million miles away from this gargantuan work. Um, and yet we have, in those final bars, the same added sixth chord, which which we hear at the end of the Song of the Earth, the same gesture of the eternal, something beyond, something which the sort of earthly word of a major trad can't contain. It's something which is stretching out beyond it. I mean, of course, the Eighth Symphony ends with a great organ-like sonority of extra brass, full organ, massive orchestra, although the chorus aren't singing at the very end. Again, rather like the Resurrection Symphony, there's this sort of sense in which the human voice can no longer express the vision of heaven that he's trying to convey. I mean, that's always, I suppose, in some ways, the Eighth Symphony of Mahler is the ultimate go at transcendence, isn't it? You can't go louder, bigger, more. I mean, you can try, but it's just not going to get any closer to that expression of transcendence. I mean, really, that Pose is the only serious rival, maybe the Delius Mass of Life. But there's a point beyond which you can't go. Probably Mahler's Eighth is it.
Yeah, and I think many would say that even try is probably a bad idea. I'm going to ask everyone
Right. I mean,
try it, I suppose, but
yes, yes.
but I'm glad that you made that comparison to Das Lied von der Erde, because I think it's such an important work in Mahler's life's evolution, and it is an essential connector. People tend to think of it as almost the opposite, like it stands outside the rest of his output, but it is the key link, both technically and thematically, between the inward facing world of the middle three symphonies and the transcendent world of the last three symphonies. He's beginning to turn his gaze from his own personal drama into something more abstract and more thinking, what's beyond the tangible world in which we live, and
Yes.
farther afield, I think. And in that sense,
Yes.
Das Lied and the Eighth Symphony are very, very close.
Yes. Not very close. I suppose they're either side of this annus horribilis year 1907, when everything went wrong for Mahler. I mean, by the time it was performed in 1910, I mean, within a year he was going to be dead. So, he was an ill man. His marriage was in trouble. He lost his job at the Vienna Opera and all these things. When he was writing the Eighth Symphony, when he had this flash of great inspiration, things were in pretty good shape at that time. And in some ways, I suppose that there is an element of personal in it. Obviously, it didn't get performed for a few years, and that intervening time, most of the stable elements of his life collapsed. He lost also a child in that time. So in that sense, yes, we can see with Das Lied von der Erde a man who's absorbed a lot of human experience between the completion of the Eighth, writing this very intimate cycle. And yet they are two sides of the same coin. They're both still really about Mother Earth in some regard. Mother Earth perhaps projected into the goddess of of the eternal feminine, but also the earth as the source of consolation in the Song of the Earth, which goes right back to the Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, Songs of a Wayfarer, where the same sentiments are present. In many, you could almost say that Mahler's whole life work was to explore this subject, which was what is our relationship with the earth that we live on, and what are our actions, what can we aspire from this place? I think it's very relevant to our own time, I think, in that regard, when we're confronted by all sorts of complex questions about our relationship with nature, not least with the COVID virus, but also within the environmental troubles and so on. These are the big questions that we face. Mahler was asking those questions in a very profound way, really 100 years ago. So I think we could do well to listen to the Eighth Symphony and Das Lied von der Erde and Mahler's other works in that light, because I think that they still have a lot to say that's very relevant to us.
Amen. Well, I think that's a perfect note on which to finish our conversation. Peter, thank you so much for being part of Virtual MahlerFest. We look forward to getting you back for real MahlerFest.
Yes.
Of course. Thank you
all.
all.
I think it's got to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, at least the beer is more readily at hand when we do
yes.
it. So, well, thank you everyone for listening, and stay tuned to MahlerFest.org, our Facebook feed and our Twitter feed throughout Digital MahlerFest. There'll be more to come. All the best.